Okay, class. So we're on the second part of the Chapter 4 assessment breakdown, where we're going to be discussing the 5 questions that involve parallel lines and transversals. So let's take a look at the first question here. This question here, they tell us that the support legs on a bench are attached in such a way that the angle made by one leg with the ground is 130 degrees. So here we can see the leg, and here we can see the angle of 130 degrees. They tell us that the bench, it said we must make sure, what must the measure of the angle x, of the angle marked x be in order for the seat of the bench to be parallel to the ground. So they want this seat here to be parallel with the ground there. Let's see if we can zoom in on that a little bit. Okay, so they want the seat to be parallel with the ground. And then what that means is that this would be a transversal and that this here would be a transversal. Well, I hope that you notice that these two angles here are in fact a linear pair, meaning that they add up to 180 degrees. So if this is 130 degrees, well then this is going to be 50 degrees here. This angle here is going to be 50 degrees because they are a linear pair. And well, now that these angles are a linear pair, you can see here that you have a transversal. And in order for these two lines to be parallel, well then this angle here and this angle here would be alternate interior angles. And if you remember, we said that alternate interior angles are congruent. So if this is 50 degrees, then this angle here is also going to be 50 degrees. Now the next question that involved parallel lines and transversals was a question asking you whether is the information sufficient, I'm sorry, what does it say here? Oh, okay. The question says, what is sufficient to prove that lines M and N are in fact parallel? So what information is sufficient to prove that lines M and N are parallel? Okay, so I ask you, the fact that the angle 3 and angle 6 are, the fact that these angles would be congruent, would that in fact be enough to prove that they're parallel? Well, if these angles are congruent, then I would have here alternate interior angles, which means that line M and line N are in fact parallel. How about the fact that angle 5 and angle 8 are congruent? Well, the fact that angle 5 and angle 8 are congruent, well, those are just vertical angles. And the fact that these two are vertical angles tells me nothing about whether these two lines are in fact parallel. How about the fact that angle 3 and angle 4 are supplementary? The fact that they add up to 180. Does the fact that these two add up to 180 have anything to do with the fact that line M and N are parallel? If you think no, then you're thinking correctly. Because yes, these are a linear pair, but then again, so are 1 and 3, so are 1 and 2, and so are 2 and 4. So the fact that 3 and 4 is a linear pair does nothing to prove to me that line M and N are in fact parallel to each other. How about the fact that angle 4 and angle 2 are supplementary? Again, the fact that these two angles are supplementary does nothing to prove the fact that these two lines are parallel. The only thing that really gives you a hint, or really gives you an indication that line M and N are parallel is if angle 3 is congruent to angle 6, because these would be alternate, they're on different sides of the transversal, interior, they're inside of the parallel lines, angles. Alternate interior angles are congruent, and that only happens between parallel lines. Let's look at another question. Here we have one transversal V, and we have all of these lines here. And the question asks, well, which set of these is a true statement? Which of these is a true statement? Are WXM parallel and YZ are parallel? WZ are parallel and XY are parallel, and so on and so forth. So let's see if this is true. Let's take a look here. Let's see if we can zoom out a little bit here. Okay, let's take a look at the first choice. Let's see if WX are parallel. Let's see if W and X are parallel. Okay, W and X. Here's W and here is X. Obviously, we can see that W and X are not parallel because these are alternating exterior angles. And if you remember the AC shortcut, anything that's alternating is congruent. So if you notice here, they're not congruent. And if you wanted to complete the pattern, you could. This would be 110, this would be 110, this would be 70. And you notice that these corresponding angles don't match. So we can see here clearly that W and X are not parallel lines. Let's look at the next one, Y and Z. Well, let's take a look here. Y and Z. Are Y and Z parallel lines? Well, look at these alternate exterior angles. Again, alternate exterior angles should be congruent, and they're not. But let's fill in the information here. Let's see. We can say then that this is 70. This would be 70. This would be 110, and these should be These are corresponding angles, which should be congruent. So again, we can see here that Y and Z are not congruent either. How about W and Z? Let's take a look at lines W and Z. Are W and Z congruent? Well, we would have to ignore all of these other lines in here and just look at these two together. Let's take a look at this. If this is 70, then this here should be 110 because these are a linear pair. And then, well, look at these. These would be corresponding angles. And again, between W and Z, do these match up? No, they do not. And this would, if these matched up, then this would be 70, and you can see that these are not a linear pair. So W and Z are not parallel lines. How about X and Y? Let's take a look at X and Y. Well, first of all, these are consecutive interior angles. But what do you notice about them? They add up to 190 degrees. And consecutive interior angles, if you remember, should be congruent. Should be supplementary. So again, you can see that X and Y are not going to be parallel. But if you wanted to go off and finish off this pattern, go ahead. You could put 100 there because these are a linear pair. And notice that these two don't match. So X and Y are also not parallel. How about W and Y? Are W and Y parallel? Well, let's take a look here. If this is 70 degrees, and this is 110, and if you notice, these match up, right? That makes sense. Let's finish the rest of the pattern. This would also be 110. This would be 70. If this is 110, then this is also 70. This would be 110, and this would be 70 as well. So we can see here that these angles correspond. All of the other angles correspond. We can see here that alternate interior angles are congruent. We can see that consecutive interior angles are supplementary, and this matches this, that matches that. 110 matches 110, 70 matches 70. So we know that W and Y are in fact congruent. So the fact that we know that W and Y is congruent helps us narrow down our choices. How about lines X and Z? X and Z, are they congruent? Well, let's look at line X. If this is 80, well then I know that this is going to be 100, this is going to be 80, and this is also going to be 100. Let me look at line Z. If this is 100, I know this is going to be 80, this will also be 100, and this will also be 80. And look at that. They match, they match, they match, they match. So lines X and Z are also parallel. So we know that W and Y are parallel, and we know that X and Z are parallel. Let's move on to our next question. Let's move on to our next question. In this situation here, we have an image that looks like this. And they're asking us, what is the measure of angle RST? They tell us that line M and N are in fact parallel. But remember, if line M and N are parallel, then this is a transversal and this is a transversal. Then we know that these angles here, this angle here, and this angle here are alternate interior angles. So if this is 30 degrees, then we also know that this angle here is also 30 degrees. And we know that when these lines are parallel and this is a transversal, then we know that these angles here are alternate interior angles as well. So if this is 40 degrees, we know that this is also 40 degrees. So we have 30 degrees here, 40 here. These are alternate interior angles. These are alternate interior angles, and they are congruent. Well, if you notice here, what we have here is a triangle. And we know that in a triangle, we have 180 degrees. Well, 40 plus 30 is 70. And 70 minus 180 gives us 110 degrees. Gives us 110 degrees. And I know that these are vertical angles, so they're congruent. So this is also 110 degrees, because I have another triangle here that should also add up to 180. So 40 and 30 is 70, plus 110 is 180. So we can see here what the measure of angle RST is, where S is the vertex, RST, and that's the measure of angle RST. Our last question shows us a transversal, and they show us two lines that they tell us that we have these two lines are parallel, and they want to know what the measure is of angle XZY. Okay, well, if you remember, if these two lines are parallel and I have a transversal going through it, then I know that these two angles are congruent because they are corresponding angles, meaning that they are matching angles. And we know that matching angles are congruent. So then, if they're congruent, I can say that x plus 72 is equal to 3x plus 12. Okay, and here we can do a little algebra. So we can see that x is equal to 30. And now that I know x is equal to 30, by setting these two equations equal to each other and solving for x, I can plug x into this variable here. So then I know that angle XZY is going to be 30 plus 72, which is going to give me 102 degrees. Just like over here, well, x is 30. Well, 3 times 30 is 90, plus 12 is also going to give me 100.